Hey everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I'm on with David Burnett. We're going to be talking about the Divine Council, sons of God, the celestial bodies that Paul talks about that humans get, and how they replace the sons of God. What does that even mean? We're talking about that today. How are you doing today, David?
Good, good. Zach, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So many of you guys might be familiar with David from his podcasts, interviews on Michael Heiser's show. So feel free to check out that later. But specifically, we're talking about David's paper, A Neglected Deuteronomic Scriptural Matrix for the Nature of the Resurrection Body in 1 Corinthians 15:39-42, linked in the description. We're going to be going through that, talking about that a little bit more detail, what's going on there. Really, really interesting article. So could you just give us a brief overview, just 5-minute summary, just what are the main points you argued in your paper?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So this paper was a long time coming. It's sort of the basic argument is it's a very long title, but the basic argument is that there is a creature list that Paul lists there in 1 Corinthians 15,
Mm-hmm.
39 through 42 of terrestrial creatures and celestial creatures. Yes, they're creatures for Paul. Generally, scholars say is drawn off of Genesis 1 and the creation narrative. And the context for why this creature list appears in 1 Corinthians 15 is he's describing the nature of the resurrection body. And so in that conversation on the nature of the resurrection body, like what is the resurrection body like?
Mm-hmm.
He refers our current bodies, our celestial bodies, as the earthly and relates them. He says they're all sarks, they're all flesh. And then he says there's another kind of body above the heavens, there's the sublunar world, the terrestrial, and above the lunar world, the celestial. And he says those are bodies of glory, he says. So he has this dichotomy of flesh beings, which is a common denotation for in Jewish Greek literature, especially in the Septuagint, for the terrestrial creatures in the sublunar sphere. And then above that, you have the celestial bodies. And this dichotomy of creatures is listed there in 1 Corinthians 15, and it relates the resurrection body to the latter, to the terrestrial, the celestial. The terrestrial bodies, the body we have now, he thinks that the resurrection body is celestial. And so I'm saying this list is actually coming from Deuteronomy 4, the famous aniconic passage. So by aniconism, if your audience is unaware of this, this is the famous text to not make graven images.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is part of the 10 Commandments, right? This is part of a fundamental piece of Israelite identity that goes into early Judaism and early Christianity, that you're not supposed to worship images. You're not supposed to make images.
Mm-hmm.
And this text is one of the famous source texts for that. And it shares a lot of the lingo and assumptions of Genesis 1 as well, making humanity in the image of God. Well, Israel is made in as an image here in Deuteronomy 4. They're taken out of the furnace of Egypt and made an image. And they're not supposed to make images of all the terrestrial creatures in Deuteronomy 4. And so they are listed, don't make graven images of them. And then they're told to look up to the heavens and see the sun, moon, and stars, all the Tsavaot of the Hashemayim, all the hosts of the heavens, which is a common term for what we might call the Divine Council or the heavenly armies, that kind of thing. It's a general term for like armies, like celestial armies or celestial forces, all the hosts of heaven. And so this is so that's the term that's applied to these celestial bodies. And what's interesting about this is there in that text, you would expect them to say, because, well, they're just, stars. They're like just burning balls of fusion up there, right? Don't worship them. You'd be silly. But he doesn't. He says, this is ancient Near Eastern cosmology. He says, the sun, moon, stars, all the hosts of heaven, don't be carried away and worship them. All those that were allotted to all the nations or peoples under the whole heavens. And so you have this allotment language of these celestial bodies who are put over the nations in Deuteronomy.
Mhm.
And Deuteronomy calls these the gods of the nations. It also calls them the sons of God. In a couple of the Septuagint traditions, it's angels of God. But it's the common belief of a patron God that's over nations and ruling over them. And so the celestial bodies are seen as that in the ancient Near Eastern world, all the way through into early Judaism and early Christianity as well. And really, a lot of ancient peoples into the late antique period and beyond. I mean, it's not really until you have a major scientific revolution that you have a lot of people saying, oh yeah, the celestial bodies aren't actually gods. It's not saying that people in the ancient world didn't think that too. There was atheists in the ancient world too, but not like there is today, obviously. But the point is, in Paul's world and in the world of the ancient Jewish scriptures and the reception of those Jewish scriptures into the early Judaism, it's very common to understand these gods of the nations as celestial bodies. And this is the comparison that Paul's trying to draw in the resurrection of the dead passage in 1 Corinthians 15. He's saying that you've bore the image of the terrestrial bodies before. Now you will bear the image of the celestial bodies, the ones who rule. And this is exactly where he goes with it. In the climax of 1 Corinthians 15, he says explicitly, he says, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. So it imagines the kingdom of God as this celestial polis, where you have rulers who rule from the heavens, everything in the sublunar sphere. And so what he envisions in his wild apocalyptic imagination that's informed with scripture and Jewish apocalypticism of the first century and before, and mixed with some Greek celestial science and philosophy to make his point. He's arguing that the seed of Abraham, his holy ones, like he says in 1 Corinthians 6, is going to judge the cosmos. They are going to judge angels. They are going to be at that level. And it's a wild text. I mean, this is a text that a lot of Christians don't fully understand because it has to do with ancient deification. So that's what it's about. You said a short version. That's probably a long version.
Oh, that's a lot better than others have done. All right, so I appreciate that. Okay, so first I want to read 1 Corinthians 15, 39 to 42, just to get just a very brief general idea of the text in general. And then I want to talk about other things like specifically Deuteronomy 4, and then we'll get into all that other stuff here. So, all right, let's see
you may
here.
want to go ahead and read it in context a little bit, like 35 through, like 35 through 40, 41 probably, or 42, something like that.
Okay, all right, that'll work. All right, so in that case, fancy time. Let's do this.
And I know you'll edit all this up.
Something like that. All right. If we can just get these ads out of the way. Stop seeing this ad. What in the world is this? Okay.
We should probably go with the NRSV.
NRSV? All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I swear I've never had this weird. Okay. NRSV. How about, is UE good enough for you?
Yeah, that's fine. The updated edition is good.
Yeah. All right. Okay. So he says, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Fool, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And as for what you sow, you do not sow the body that is to be but a bare seed, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. Not all flesh is alike, but there is one flesh for humans, another for animals, and another for birds, and another for fish. There are both heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one thing, and the that of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars. Indeed, stars differ from the star in glory. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable. What is raised is imperishable. And then it talks about other stuff like Adam and death and stuff like that. So in this context, was there anything that, now that we have like a general basis for this passage, was there anything that you wanted to bring up before we start talking about Deuteronomy?
Yeah, I mean the context is really important here, and a lot of folks want to easily fit it into a context that may be more native for them.
Mm-hmm.
So in Christian theological readings of this text,
Mm-hmm.
there are a lot of New Testament scholars who are also sort of theologians that often will try to make this text sound more plausible or feasible for contemporary theology. And there's problems with this because you have to have sort of an ancient under Mediterranean view of cosmology, how the world is ordered, to really understand what's going on in this text, I think. So I would argue, and many others have argued. So I mean, what I'm saying right now is not new. The idea that understanding the universe as like a scala naturae is like a scaled hierarchy. There's higher orders of beings the higher you go up into the cosmos. And so it's a tiered cosmos in their mind. And so we're sort of in the terrestrial sphere and in the sublunar sphere. And then above the lunar sphere, there's hierarchies. And so you're sort of, you're a terrestrial one down here in the sublunar sphere. But the assumption here is in the resurrection, they're actually moving up to a celestial order. And so this is where a lot of Paul scholars get it wrong, because a lot of Paul scholars will say, trying to massage it with canonical readings and other sort of New Testament theology, will try to massage it into this a text that'll work with other texts that might emphasize more a resurrection that is earthly. You get up and have an earthly body. You're on this earth. It doesn't perish. It might be empowered by the Spirit or something, or there's all kinds of words that scholars will use to translate this. But the main idea for a lot of Christian readings of this text has been that they will get up on a new earth and they'll be on the earth, right? And they'll have new bodies that don't die. But this is not at all what Paul is saying. Matter of fact, it's the opposite of that. He's actually saying the terrestrial body's going out the window and we need to inherit a celestial body. That's the one that, because all these bodies in this cosmic hierarchy that is listed here, they have bodies that are fit for their habitats. And this is what I start the whole article with, is the important thing to recognize here is the argument for the bodied resurrection and embodied resurrection, because that is the crux of his argument. These are all different bodies. All these beings that Paul lists, he assumes have bodies. This is not the case for a lot of Greeks. Okay? So a lot of Greeks will think, who are Platonists or academics, the inheritors of Plato's school, will think that the celestial bodies up there are really more minds or souls. These souls are disembodied. They're asomaton. They do not have bodies. Plato's really big on this. The body's like a prison house for the soul. A virtuous soul really wants to escape the prison house of the body. And its light and virtue can ascend to the heights and become a star or a god or something. Plato would call this the assimilation to divine or assimilation to God. And this is technical language for what we would call apotheosis or deification in some contexts. And so this is used in, say, famous commentators like Philo of Alexandria in the first century, a contemporary of Paul, but writing in Alexandria, a famous commentator on Scripture, famous philosopher and sage. He is not a Protestant Christian by any means. He is a Jewish sage of the first century. who is commenting on Genesis and special laws in the context of philosophical debates and polemics. And in those contexts, he talks about the assimilation to God, using the technical language of Plato for the ascending to heaven of the virtuous soul. And he uses similar texts that Paul does, very interestingly. And so, yet the Stoics, interestingly enough, in that period, they would argue against the Platonists when it comes to the nature of the gods, the nature of these celestial bodies. They would say, no, they do have bodies. They are not unbodied. You know, they have these minds and souls, they have bodies as well. And they would be made, for some Stoics, made out of pneumatic stuff. You know, some would say ether. You know, it's the fifth element, the element of the heavens, you know, the stuff that doesn't perish. It's like very airy, finite, not finite, but fine grain stuff, like really pass through wall type stuff, you know. You know, if you're made of pneuma, you could do that. But it's still a substance. You have an actual body. And so this would be intelligible, the language of like celestial bodies having actual bodies. This would be intelligible in like philosophical debates about the nature of the gods in this period, in the first century. And it had been going on for some time before that. So Paul, if he's had Greek paideia, Greek training, which most people say he did, you know, has Greek schooling, has probably read the philosopher. We know he's read the philosophers. He'll reference them. He knows famous Greek literature all the time. He's relatively sophisticated in that regard. And so he knows, he's probably very well aware of those debates, but what he's concerned with is convincing these Corinthians that the resurrection from the dead, this apocalyptic eschatological event, is coming to pass. This is going down. It is going to happen. It is not some sort of allegory for just the life of the soul, and there is no real end time. There is no real judgment. The gods are fine. No, for Paul, they're not. There needs to be a huge cosmic judgment. And according to him, his holy ones are going to be involved in that. So it's pretty wild stuff.
Yeah. I'll be interested to dive into that a little bit more. So you have this passage. You talked about how lots of people think that Paul is essentially, you know, referencing Genesis 1. So could you briefly talk about why scholars think that? If that's what he is doing, why would he reference that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it makes perfect sense that everyone would say Genesis 1 for the most part, because in the context of 1 Corinthians 15 here, he talks about the first Adam and the last Adam. And he even quotes from Genesis 2:7, a very popular verse of becoming a life. Goodness, my mind just went blank here.
Dust.
A man of dust. Yeah, the man from the dust. I'm grading finals right now, so it's like my mind is like on high school theology finals I'm trying to grade. But no, so it's very common to take this view, and I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with it on its face. But the problem is when you want to read in the wider context of what Paul's trying to argue, he's trying to argue for this movement to become celestial bodies. This is a polarity in his argument between these two Adams. And there's already precedent for this notion of a first Adam and then an Adam that follows. Already a precedent for this in the Hebrew Bible and its reception. A lot of scholars will go to Philo. This is very common. Greg Sterling, famous scholar from Yale, and others have written articles on this about what do we do with this two Adam thing going on in 1 Corinthians 15? Well, some will say, oh, it's the two creation stories in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, where you have the creation of the first Adam with Eve, and they are rulers over the whole earth. And then Genesis 2, you have a totally different creation story where Adam is made from the dust. And it's before everything else that goes down in Genesis 1. And so it's a very different story, and Jewish exegetes knew this, and they were sort of doing interesting things with the text. Philo, as like a philosopher, is saying, well, you have this the second Adam becoming what the Hebrew would say is a nephesh, is a psyche, a soul in Greek, and when it's translated in Greek. And so you have this like soulish, heavenly Adam, and then you have this earthly, dustly Adam. And what you really want to be, and it's all allegory for the soul. It's like what you really want to be is a living soul. And so a lot of people go there. It's like, oh, this might be the source for the two Adam thing, because Paul uses this language of soma psychikon, a soulish body, versus a pneumatic body. Those are the separations he makes between the terrestrial body on the one hand and the celestial body on the other. One is what he calls soma psychikon, soulish body. The other one he calls a soma pneumatikon, a pneumatic body. It's normally translated in English spiritual body, but this is a body of that the celestial bodies have, that kind of body. So so it's common that people would go back to Genesis 1, but the problem is Genesis 4 is one of those texts that already presumes there is another Adam. And it portrays Israel, I argue, in this chapter, it portrays Israel as an image that's being made, just like the first Adam, as an image that's being made through the furnace, through the fire. That's the image that's used for coming out of Egypt, and they become, in the Exodus tradition, the Son of God. They're his firstborn. They're his elect. They're his chosen ones. So they're his holy ones. And so they're not under what Paul and other Jews would call the principalities and powers, which is just common Greek Jewish language for the gods of the other nations. Citing these same texts from Deuteronomy, by the way, same ones. So Paul's saying, in one sense, Paul's saying nothing new in the sense that he believes that Israel and Jews, who are the chosen ones, are not under these principalities and powers like the other nations are. They're under the Most High God himself. The Creator himself is their God. So it raises them up to the level of sons of God. Whereas the sons of God, a common term for like the lesser divine beings in the heavens, is often referenced as his divine council. And in certain biblical texts like Psalm 82, they are called the divine council or the council of El. They rule over those nations. And so what Paul envisions here is pretty radical. He's taking the same creature list as Deuteronomy that they're not supposed to go after and worship. And he's saying, you're going to become like them. Because this was sort of the promise to Israel to begin with. This is how they understand their exodus. And Paul thinks a new exodus is happening in his own day, and it's eschatological. He thinks it's going down. And so it should not be surprising then that you use a very common exodus motif of becoming the image of God in Deuteronomy 4, and as a grounds for not going after and worshiping those gods anymore. And that's what he's called his Gentiles to do, to leave their gods behind. He says, you once worshiped these eating meals with daimonia, eating meals with demons in 1 Corinthians, citing Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, where it talks about these sons of God and the gods they went after in the wilderness. It calls them daimonia because the daimonia were it's a common Greek term for like the real lower tier guys in the heavens that are put over all the polises, in the beginning. And so Greeks have similar, conceptually similar ideas that you have to have an origin story of like, how did all these peoples get their gods and stuff and have their own cults in temples and stuff and own worship of their own gods? Where did they get there? So everybody has their own version. The Jewish version is the Tower of Babel. And so Abraham's taken out from the 70 nations and the sons of God are put over the 70 nations. Now you have Israel become the sons of God, the sons of the Most High. And so in their election and in their exodus, taken out from under Egypt, and they become God's nation on the cosmic mountain, where Moses goes up and gets the divine law and everything. This is this is embedded in Israel's identity, their narrative. Well, that gets eschatologized, if I can use that word, later in Jewish apocalypticism to imagine a new Exodus in the future. And Paul very much imagines this, and it's cosmic. And Gentiles get to get in on this, that they're taken out from under their gods, and they're going to become like the gods, which is something that a lot of Jewish apocalypticists already believed long before Paul.
Really interesting. Okay, so you talked about Deuteronomy 4 here. So was there anything else you wanted to add in regards to what's going on with Deuteronomy 4 and what Paul's doing?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I argue that he's referencing this text is it's part of a wider Deuteronomic matrix, like a scriptural matrix of texts that all refer to these gods of the nations as the celestial bodies. And he's already done this. He's already referred to Deuteronomy 4 and 6 already, way back in 1 Corinthians 8. And that whole anti-idolatry section from 8 to 11, he's already referenced these traditions. And I'm of the persuasion that 1 Corinthians is a unified text. It's all one letter, just answering different questions. I don't think it's like a pastiche. There are some scholars that still think that it's like pieced together. But I think Paul's already argued from Deuteronomy 4 before, and it's all leading to this sort of climactic issue. He saves sort of the best for last, the resurrection from the dead, which he says all of our faith is for nothing if this isn't true, So everything hinges on this for him, this event. The resurrection of Jesus is the first fruits of the great harvest. This is this Levitical image of the eschaton. There's a lot of harvest imagery in the New Testament for the eschaton, right? We hear Jesus use this all the time, right? This eschatological harvest that's about to go down. The angels are going to separate the righteous from the unrighteous is going down. So Paul's thinking this is happening, and this is the main issue. And so, that's what's at stake here. Is we want to if we want to ask historical questions of Paul and figure out what did he actually mean in the first century when he's writing this to people who he assumes knows these stories of Exodus, and apparently he assumes they know some scripture too, and have been taught these things because he's citing it all the time and he's referencing it and alluding it all the time. So whether they did or not is irrelevant. Because what we're trying to understand is Paul's own rhetorical goals here. And the reason why he would bring in Deuteronomy 4, it's part of this wider matrix of text that would have been recognizable to anyone who knew the Torah relatively well, that, hey, these are the reasons we don't go after these other gods. And for some of the apocalypticists, it's like, hey, because we'll become like them one day. And in Paul's day, he thinks they are. This is the time.
Interesting. Okay, so let's get into that matrix. So one of the reasons that you come to that conclusion is because of Philo. So he talks about Deuteronomy 4 as well in a similar way. This is the text on the screen. Can you talk about what the importance for Philo is? What kind of references is he making?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's because of Philo I see it. Okay. I mean, my argument is an exegetical one as well as a conceptual and theological one in terms of historical theology in Paul's own day. But yes, the evidence that from the Second Temple authors that use Deuteronomy 4 is quite surprising. So I cite a famous text from Philo's Special Laws 1, where he is sort of lampooning Greeks for attributing the celestial bodies, the gods, with all the fates and sort of all the destiny of humankind rests on them, that they're autocratic gods, There's no sort of god higher than them. They are the gods. That's it. Full stop. There's some deeper philosophical critique that's going on here, but just for the sake of this argument, what I refer to Philo here in Special Laws 4, and I do this in a couple of other pieces as well, is to show how Deuteronomy 4 is being used often to talk about these other gods and what their role is. And so here in Philo's Special Laws, we can just read the text together. Some have supposed that the sun and moon and other stars were gods with absolute powers, or autocratic gods is what they're called, theus autokratoras. and ascribed to them the causation of all events. But Moses held that the cosmos was created and is, in a sense, the greatest of commonwealths. It's the Megisti Polis, it's the greatest polis there is, having rulers, and this is where we get the terms archontas, excusa. These are the same terms that Paul uses, principalities and powers, so-called, but these are common Greek terms for the gods. He says, and subjects for rulers, the archontas, all the celestial bodies, fixed or wandering. So the oronopantas. So this is what Paul will call the resurrected ones. He'll call them celestial bodies as well, and likens their body to them. So back to Philo, all the celestial bodies, fixed or wandering, for subjects, such beings that exist below the moon, in the air or on the earth. The said rulers, however, in this view, have not unconditional powers, but are lieutenants of the one Father of all. And it's by copying the example of his government, exercised according to justice and law over all created beings, that they acquit themselves aright. But those who do not describe the charioteer mounted above attribute the causation of all events in the cosmos to the team that draw the chariot, as though they were the sole agents. So this is where the sort of critique comes in. It's like, why would you worship the guys that draw the chariot, not the guy in the chariot, right? And where does he go for this? He has a scriptural basis for this critique. Mm-hmm. He goes to Deuteronomy 4, the same passage, 4:19, where he says, from the ignorance our most holy lawgiver would convert them to knowledge with these words, quote, do not, when thou seest the sun, the moon, and the stars, and all the ordered host of heaven, go astray and worship them. So don't do it. He says, it's indeed and aptly that they call the acceptance of the celestial bodies as gods, going astray and wandering. And later he says, they have wandered infinitely far in supposing that they alone are gods. That's why these Greeks have gone infinitely far in Philo's mind. Not because he says they're gods. Everybody, including Philo and other Jews, assume that they're gods. Where the Greeks get off track, he says, is they go far to assume that they are the only gods. They are the autocratic rulers. They rule in and of themselves. They're not autocrats. They have to copy the Father of all. They are subordinate. They are rulers who have been delegated their authority, right? That's how he imagines them. Now, with Philo, he says that because they're subordinate rulers, this is how he closes it out. They're naturally liable to correction, though in virtue of their excellence, they're never destined to undergo it. So for him, he's like, yeah, they're virtuous. They're not the issue. That's not the issue. It's the individual soul. It's mastering the virtues. Those who have mastered the virtues will come to, obviously, has some Jewish exceptionalism here, that, it's us. We have the high God. We know the real truth. The virtuous soul will eventually get there, And so that's the critique. So he uses Deuteronomy 4 this way to talk about the gods, using the same language that Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15. But for Paul, there's a big difference. For Paul, he says these principalities and powers and rulers, they're being judged. They are going to be destroyed. So he sees their end. He thinks they're bad. So this is where the tie-in that I mentioned earlier to 1 Corinthians 6. This whole idea of his holy ones, that he calls them, which, by the way, is a very common term for heavenly beings all throughout the Hebrew Bible. So holy ones is just a ubiquitous term for the beings up there. And it's literally up there for them in their cosmology, So Israel is as well called holy ones, right? Psalm 89 is a famous text for this. Psalm 89 will say, who amongst the holy ones is like you, Yahweh? Assuming that he's in the council of the holy ones. So this is a common term for them. So the idea that these holy ones are drawn out, and in Paul's mind, they're actually going to participate in the eschatological judgment, the end time judgment. In 1 Corinthians 6, he's critiquing them because they're going to Roman magistrates to try to work out their, differences. And he's like, what are you doing? are you idiots? This is like David Burnett translation, But he's like, why are you going to the Roman magistrates? He's like, don't you know you're to judge the cosmos? And it's the same term here you would use for cosmos. It's imagining the world as a great polis, where don't you know you're going to be the judges? And he says, don't you know, in the parallel he draws in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, don't you know you are to judge angels? And so this whole idea of an angelic host or a divine host that's apportioned over the cosmic order, and that they've gone wrong somehow, or they've done bad. You see this view ever since Daniel and before. I mean, this goes all the way back to Isaiah. So this whole idea of heavenly hosts that are bad, that need to be judged in the last day and the final judgments, this goes all the way back to Isaiah. So this is a very common tradition in Jewish apocalypticism at the time of Paul. And so that wouldn't be new. But what is different, what makes Paul different, is obviously thinking that the Messiah is Jesus, the Nazarene who was crucified, because God has exalted him, vindicated him. He ascends to heaven. He becomes the very last Adam. He's the celestial that we are going to be made in the image of, not the terrestrial any longer. He's a life-giving pneuma now. He's a life-giving spirit now. He's not flesh and blood in the same way we're flesh and blood. This is Paul's words. This is not some idiosyncratic historian's take. This is Paul's words he uses for the situation that we're in now, from the situation we'll be in the resurrection from the dead, which is that it's an event for him. It's not just like when he talks about the resurrection from the dead, he's not talking about just getting up from the grave. That's obvious. Obviously, that's part of it. But it's part of a wider complex for him. Because every time he describes the actual action of God in that event, he titles the event 4 times, and it's with that definite article, so the resurrection from the dead. But then when he describes what God is doing, he says, not anastasis, the famous term for resurrection, but he says ekiro. He raises them up. He raises them up, which for Paul, and this is where a lot of scholars get him wrong. For Paul, it does not mean just raising them up to just live on the earth again. No, it's literally raising them up to the heavens. So do they get a body? Absolutely. But it is a body like the celestial bodies have. It's not perishable like the terrestrial bodies are. It's imperishable like the celestial bodies are. That's the gist.
Okay. All right. So you briefly mentioned it earlier, the whole Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I just really wanted to mention that for people not familiar with it. So this is Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 in the Septuagint. So when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the nations according to the numbers of the angels of God, and his people, Jacob, became the Lord's portion. Israel is the allotment of his inheritance. And I guess people like you and Michael Heiser argue this is having something to do with Genesis 11, Tower of Babel. And how does this specifically connect to Deuteronomy 4 and what Philo and Paul does? Could you be explicit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not just me and Michael Heiser thing. I mean, me and Mike, may he rest in peace. Me and Mike were dear friends. He was a mentor of mine when I was younger and in college, and he was my master's thesis reader and all that. And,
that's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, we'd room together at SBL and stuff. I love him dearly. His family's
awesome.
like family to me. But I disagree with him on a million things. But that's the way scholarship is, right?
Right.
So this whole idea of, I think a lot of people say the Divine Council Worldview or something, but this is in wider scholarship of the ancient Mediterranean world, not just Christians, not just Jews, atheist, agnostic, anybody who's interested in ancient religious history, who studied the biblical literature in the context of other ancient Mediterranean literature at the time, and ancient Near Eastern literature at the time, knows this worldview, this it's just their cosmology, that you have lower gods who are placed over the nations. And every culture in the ancient Mediterranean had different narratives of how those gods got there. because you're living in a God-saturated world in the ancient Mediterranean.
Right.
There's gods everywhere, sometimes on every street corner if you're in a big polis, like Corinth or something, you know? So you have your people, your ethnic people, have your own distinctive narrative of how those gods got there, you know, that fits your worldview and your take on it. And so the biblical tradition or the biblical anthology coming from ancient Israel through into early Judaism, the common etiology, which is an origin story is the Tower of Babel story, right? The Tower of Babel story, when the Kol Haaretz, the whole earth, is in sort of this rebellion towards God. I know some people don't like to read it as a rebellion. I still do. I think it is a rebellion. Because it's part of three big cosmic rebellions in Genesis 1 through 11. It's really the climactic one, honestly, because that's what gets us Abraham. The narrative's very brilliantly constructed. Redacted as it is brilliantly constructed. So the way that goes, they want to build a tower to the heavens. Some people say this is a ziggurat, whatever. The point is, everybody in the ancient Near East would say, okay, this is like temple stuff. You know, you're trying to build a tower to the heavens and make a name for themselves. You know, this is what Israel does. You know, when they build a temple or when you build a tabernacle, it's a place for my name to dwell. You know, this is where like the presence of the God would be, the divine name and all that. So the idea of making the great name, you know, up in the heavens in a tower for yourself, it's like they're looking for that becoming like the God's stuff, the whole world now, not just Adam and Eve. You know, you know, God knows you'll be like Elohim, the Elohim, you'll be like the gods, you know. This is that multiplied by the whole world, right? So this is like the ancient Israelite etiology for like, why are all these nations out here with their gods and all that? You know what? Well, here it is. This is their version of the story. So they've tried to do that. They're separated. Yahweh comes down, surveys the situation like, oh, crap. You know, we got to separate these guys. And so he says, let us separate their languages. And this us is the same us you hear in Genesis 1. Let us make man in our image. And he's to rule the whole world. So this idea of rulership and the us thing, all Hebrew Bible scholars and ancient Near Eastern scholars will say, okay, this is divine council language. You know, this is a council of the gods type language. That's what we have here. And that's what we find all throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's everywhere. And in the New Testament too, surprise, surprise, if you didn't know that. I mean, it doesn't go away. So this whole idea of a divine council never goes away. And so where it connects this worldview that you see right here with Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 4 is a key passage in that worldview in Deuteronomy. Part of this larger scriptural matrix I'm talking about, where there's a lot of text throughout Deuteronomy, and I go through them in the two publications I have related to this, is you go through and see the way Deuteronomy lays it out. It keeps referring back to when these beings, these divine beings, were put and allotted over the nations, over the peoples. So the Deuteronomy 4 passage directly relates to this Deuteronomy 32 passage in that way. It's part of that wider complex of Deuteronomy of like, why don't you go after those other gods? Well, the gods you did not know, the gods that did not deliver you. I'm the God that delivered you, Yahweh says. So it's always little g God here. You know, they believe that these gods are real. So this parallel language here in Deuteronomy 4 parallels exactly to Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 17, 29. There's a number of texts that reference these celestial bodies, gods that are allotted to peoples under the whole heavens. This is difficult for some people who don't realize this stuff is in their Bibles. But not only is it in their Bibles, this informs not just ancient Israelite cosmology, but the development of early Judaism. Like how do Jews relate to other nations and peoples? You know, depending on their context, they might read this story a little differently and tweak it differently. Like Philo's reading of it is very different than Paul's. Yet their conceptual frameworks, they're working within the same conceptual frameworks of the cosmos, how they imagine the cosmos. Now, there's differences on like the ontology of things, like what are they made of? Are they bodied? Are they unbodied? Is there really an eschaton? Is there not? Are you a Middle Platonist? Are you a Stoic? There's all kinds of debates you can have within that wider tent. So if you zoom way out, like us ancient historians do, looking back, this is what we call etic description instead of imic. Etic description is we're looking back and we're trying to describe as a critic, as an analyst, looking back at the literature, what did these people mean, and using categories of our own language to describe it. So when we try to reconstruct their cosmology, like how they viewed the world, but then when we look at something imically, is you go from inside and like, how would they talk to each other? What language do they use with each other? So we can zoom out and describe their religion, historically, and say, oh, look, this looks like an origin story like other origin stories in the ancient Mediterranean. And then we can zoom in and see the imic language, how they talk to each other. What language are they using to describe it? And try to do that. So my historical project is very much trying to capture a reconstruction of what the first century Jewish crazy wild-eyed apocalypticist Paul is actually saying.
Yeah, all right. So that's really interesting, and it also connects to Psalm 82 as well. So could you briefly talk about that and how that relates to the whole, Paul discussion?
Yeah. So what I argue, and this is a crux of my dissertation, and it's already mentioned in this book chapter as well, is what I'm arguing is that Psalm 82 is a famous text that talks about the judgment of the gods in the end. Some end. It imagines in some sort of judgment of the gods. And there's a lot of different scholarly perspectives on when this text is written and what it's referring to specifically.
Yeah.
But we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls and a few other texts outside the Dead Sea Scrolls that this text, Psalm 82, was often used, I would argue often, used in eschatological constructions of the end, like the end time, the final denouement, as the French would say, right? The final climactic moment. And so Psalm 82 is read eschatologically. We see this in 11Q Melchizedek at Qumran. We see this, and I'm arguing that Psalm 82 is actually sort of the narrative framework of how Paul imagines the end. And so if you're not familiar with Psalm 82, you need to go back and read it. I see you have it pulled up here. So God stands in the assembly of the gods. I included just the Greek translation of it, not the Hebrew, because I'm referring to the Greek of Paul and showing how the language works. But God stands in the assembly of the gods. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. And he says, how long will you judge unjustly? And he goes into this further, critiquing them for their unjust judgment of the world. And then later he says, I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. So this is the same Deuteronomic vision of the world, right? Where you have the Most High God who's divvied up the nations to the other gods, the sons of God, the sons of the Most High, or the angels of God, whatever you want to call them, right? He says, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you, but you are all dying like men, or you will die like men. There's different translations of this. And like one of the rulers, and here's the words, archonton, you fall, or you will fall in Hebrew. And so the psalmist ends it. So that's the end of like the judgment scene, where this divine figure, this God figure, which for 11Q Melchizedek, this famous text from Qumran, 11Q13, it means it's found in Cave 11, and it's just the 13th one that they, I don't know how they divvy out the numbers of all these with all the fragments and stuff, but 11Q Melchizedek, famous text about that weird guy Melchizedek from Psalm 110 and Genesis 14. That will take Psalm 82 and say, hey, this is Melchizedek. He's the one doing this. He's the Psalm 82. He's the God of Psalm 82. It says, yeah, that God guy who's doing the judgment of the heavenly host, That's Melchizedek, he says. So right here, the psalmist closes out the psalm by saying, God, arise and judge all the earth, for the nations are your inheritance. So there's this arising language in Greek is anastasis. Anasta is the language for resurrection that Paul uses. So the idea of the resurrection that results in the kleronomia, in Greek, the inheritance. This is an Abrahamic motif of like the promised inheritance to the patriarchs. That one day the God of Israel and his people, they will inherit the cosmos back. This is what Paul says. Paul says in Romans 4 that the promise to Abraham is that he would inherit the cosmos. So this is a pretty big promise, and he even links it to the resurrection there. My first article was on Romans 4. So if you're unfamiliar with how some early Jews read Psalm 82, this judgment of the God scene, then you won't see these connections. But someone who is familiar with it and looks at the language, it's mind-boggling. It's like it is like a lighthouse is pointing right at it, like, whoa. And you look at all the linguistic connections, like resurrection language, the inheritance, just like ending the inheritance of the kingdom of God. The holy ones are there judging the evil spirits of Belial's lot. So the allotment language to evil spirits, and imagine 11Q Melchizedek imagines that the spirits that are put over the world are actually evil. And Belial, there's this chief evil figure, just like Paul will have the Satan, or Satan, So this type of a worldview, this is not like a one-to-one thing. A lot of people say, oh, is this text referencing this text? No, I'm talking about the general conceptual framework, like the general narratives of the day, what people were doing with texts when they imagine this eschatological moment, this final end of days scenario. So people could construe it a lot of different ways. And for Paul, this Melchizedekian figure, the figure from Psalm 110, is Jesus. He's the guy. He's the final judge. And this is exactly what Paul references. He cites Psalm 110. Make the enemies a footstool for his feet. As many of your listeners probably know, Psalm 110 is the most cited Old Testament text there is in the New Testament. And there's a reason for that.
That's really, really cool. Okay, so then you have Sirach, who has a whole nother take on this that's interesting in itself. So could you talk about that? What's going on here?
Yeah, this was an important one in my book chapter, and I think only one person has caught on this. I think Jason Staples references this.
Nice.
Yeah, he's an old buddy of mine, a good friend. He cites this article quite a bit in his book, but he's one of the ones that's caught the Syriac imagery here, because I think it's important to know these traditions before you get to Paul, because Sirach, what he does, very similar to Philo, he imagines them being put over the nations. This is just a common etiology for the origins of the gods and their nations. But there's an interesting connection he makes. So this text in Sirach 17, 1-4, it reads, "The Lord created man out of the earth and makes them return to it again." So this is their perishability, right? They're mortal. They're from the earth. They return to it again. He gave them a fixed number of days, but granted them authority over everything on the earth. And this is the same words of authority that you'll see, like in Paul. He endowed them with strength like his own, and made them in his own image. So just like the image language, we see the Adam and the image of God stuff going on in 1 Corinthians 15. He put the fear of them in all flesh. Notice he says all flesh, and gave them dominion over the beasts and the birds. So when he lists beasts and birds, he's talking about, again, this hierarchy. In creation, man is put over as rulers of the earth, and he's put over all these beasts and birds, and he calls them flesh. It's like a general term in Greek for sarkos, of all the sort of terrestrial beings that Adam is sort of put in charge over, right? He's the highest of them. This is the same language we find in Paul with the terrestrial bodies that we have now, and he lists them in this creature list, from man and woman, beasts of the field, birds of the heavens, fish of the sea, that kind of deal. He says they're all sarkos, they're all sarks, they're all flesh. That's what he calls them in 1 Corinthians 15:2. So this is just a very common way, a generic way of talking about the terrestrial creatures. But what's interesting here is what Sirach goes on to do. Because Sirach, in the very same context, it goes on to talk about, drawing on the creation of Adam, the creation of Israel as well. And so I highlight this, and it says, it makes this connection with Deuteronomy 4 explicit, actually, with this election of Israel that it goes on to mention, and saying it draws this creation of Adam with the creation of Israel. There's a direct connection there, just like Deuteronomy 4 makes. Same connection Deuteronomy 4 makes. And so this is the layer that I think a lot of people don't realize, because if you keep reading Sirach in context, in Sirach 17, you see that Deuteronomic matrix come up again when he says he appointed a ruler for every nation, but Israel is the Lord's own portion. That's like almost a direct quotation of Deuteronomy 32:8. So all of this is in the same context. The idea of Adam being created as the ruler of the terrestrial creatures, but then the creation of Israel is likened to the creation of Adam. It's like Israel's like a new Adam. And this is just stereotypical Hebrew Bible stuff. Because if you're very familiar with Genesis, Abraham is a new Adam in the story, right? The whole world has rebelled. And there's 70 nations, the table of the 70 nations in Genesis 10, and gives you the whole narrative in 11. Well, what is Genesis 12? The calling of Abraham, where he's called out from under them. There's that threefold challenge of leave your land, leave your land, your people, your father's house, and go to the land I'll show you, right? And he does. He's like, I'll make you a great nation, right? I'll give you an inheritance. So this is the beginning of Israel. So the whole thing is like, and you're going to be fruitful and multiply, right? So this whole idea is like, that's his new Adam. That's his new, the rest of the world, he's appointed other gods to them and let them be. But he saved this one for himself. And so this idea of like saving him from out from under the powers as a new Adam is not new. So this language of saving people out from under the gods and delivering them and them becoming like a new Adam, like the image of God to rule, like the gods. So it's not new. This is a Hebrew Bible type. This is a Hebrew Bible trope, and it gets used over and over and over again in Second Temple literature. And so if you miss the Israel portion of this, like that we see in Deuteronomy 4, that other Jewish texts see as well, then it's like you're missing a whole layer of the discussion when you get to Paul. You see what I'm saying?
Interesting. So on that Sirach text, I wanted to ask you about. So, do you think that is like an archetypal view? Is Sirach? Because it's really weird in the discussion. We'll have to talk about this another time. But like he talks about he uses the word Adam. And I don't know if the Hebrew or the Greek or whatever, how that works exactly, but he's talking about the original creation, which to Adam and it can be used for humanity, it could be used for man, it could be used the personal noun. So like there's a weird thing going on there just in Genesis in general, but then Sirach seems to be doing something weird with that, and then it just randomly talks about Israel with no changing context. It seems like exactly the same thing going on. So what do you think's going on there?
Well, you inadvertently and unintendingly made the error that a lot of people make is saying that, well, that's weird. Why just mention immediately Israel, as if you're talking about Adam and relating them. It's like, well, no, I think everybody, all good Jewish exegetes and readers of holy scriptures and stuff, the ancient Jewish writings would be very familiar with this concept. And because it's fundamental to ancient Israelite and thus later early Jewish identity for many Jews, is this understanding that they are a new Adam. And there's other Adams, so like they're the idealized version of humanity. They're the ones that are elected out and made God's son, and all that. So that's already well established. I mean, the literary connections in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, with the rest, with other places in Torah, and I'm talking about like the final redacted version of Torah that's received later. And even saying final is complicated. Like, what does that even mean? But in these early Jewish ways of reading the story of Israel, it's definitely like the creation story, like the Adam story. Exodus and creation have all kinds of literary overlap. And the Adam story being banished from the garden, just like Israel's banished from the land and all this. And the Garden of Eden being a temple and being banished from the east, the gate of the temple faces the east and all that. These are just literary connections that lots of other Hebrew Bible scholars have already made. And lots of ancient Jews knew, and lots of rabbis now know, is that the connections between Adam and Israel is explicit in the literature. So for us, who may not know that at first, this might be surprising. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, what? Israel and Adam, is that the same? It's like, yeah, well, for many ancient Jews, they're just like, duh, yeah, because Deuteronomy 4 says explicitly, if you keep reading Deuteronomy 4, and I mentioned this in my chapter, in context, it says in Deuteronomy 4:32, it relates the creation of Israel, which really happens in the Exodus. They're purchased and made a nation. In Deuteronomy 4, he says, since the day God created human beings on the earth, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened, the creation of Israel. So that's like as in your face as it comes. He's like, Deuteronomy has already said explicitly that the creation of Israel as a people there's nothing greater that's ever happened since the creation of man, since the creation of human beings, anthropon. So in Greek. So this is a big deal, this is a big connection. And so when you can make these connections and you go back to a text like 1 Corinthians, it talks about Christ as last Adam, not as second, as last. A lot of people try to merge like Romans 5's Adam language with 1 Corinthians 15, and that's a big failure. Don't do that. Don't do that. These are two very different rhetorical contexts, very, very different rhetorical contexts. There's some relation, but what he's rhetorically doing in 1 Corinthians 15 is, I would argue, is actually more complex. It's bringing in the whole complex of Israel's story. And because resurrection of the dead is an Israel story. This is an Israel apocalyptic belief. This is not a common Greek belief. This is very strict Jewish apocalyptic narrative he has in mind. And he's already developed the whole idea of new Exodus in 1 Corinthians already, right? If you go back to 1 Corinthians 10, he's already said, hey, you guys, the holy ones now, my holy ones, his assembly of God that he's got, they've already said, we are drinking from the same spiritual drink they had, the rock which followed them, which was Christ, right? We're eating the same spiritual food and all this. And those stories of Exodus, which were our fathers, he says to a bunch of Greeks, he's like, they're our fathers. He's assuming that they've been baptized, just like in Exodus, they were baptized into Moses. So now we're baptized into Christ, right? They ate the same spiritual food and drink that we eat now, the spiritual pneumatic food and drink, the pneumatic stuff, the stuff of the heavens. Elsewhere in the Psalms, it says that Israel ate the bread from the food of angels, you know? So they believe that their existence is becoming angelic, becoming divine, you know? They're going to participate in the judgment of the angels. They're going to inherit the cosmos. It is some wild apocalyptic stuff.
Hmm. You briefly talked about in your paper on 1 Corinthians 10. What does this passage have, and what's the relevance there, 20 to 21?
I'm sorry, the relevance.
1 Corinthians 10, 20 to 21. What's the relevance of this passage to the rest
Oh,
of the
yeah,
topic?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mentioned in my argument, 1 Corinthians 10, the relevance here is that Paul uses the language that when you were Gentiles, or sometimes it's translated pagans, because they sacrifice and offer to demons. You know, Paul rarely talks about demons, but this is a specific quotation in this context, Deuteronomy 32, where the gods they went after in the wilderness and betrayed, you know, their covenant with the Most High. In the story, it says that in the Septuagint version, they went after demons, the daimonia. And this is the term, the common term in Greek tradition in the ancient Mediterranean of the lower tier little gods. You know, I think Paula Friedrichsen likes to call them godlings or something. The lower tier guys that are put over the polises, you know. And he's like, you're going and eating with them. You know, he's like, I don't want you to be participants of demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. So that what pagans do, what Gentiles do, you don't do anymore. You know, your baptism is your Exodus waters. You have left there. You are not under those gods anymore. You do not worship those daimoni anymore. Now, notice he doesn't reject their existence. He says you're actually eating with daimonia if you do. If you still are participating in those temples and doing this thing, you are really eating with daimonia, these little lower tier godlings, you know, these lower tier divine beings. But he's like, you're not anymore. You know, you've been taken out from under there. He says, when you were ethne. It's really fascinating. So in my argument in the chapter, I'm arguing that they're, in a sense, they're not ethne anymore. You know, he'll talk about them as ethne all the time in a very practical, earthly, day-to-day sense. But in this like apocalyptic, eschatological sense, they are becoming like the gods, you know. So they were under the daimoni at one point. They're not anymore.
Ethne being pagans, Gentiles.
Yep.
But now they are not anymore. All right.
Yeah,
so
they're going through an Exodus experience like Israel went through, but this time it's a cosmic one. You know, they're being taken out from under their gods, and they're going to get in on this huge cosmic inheritance. It's like a massive Exodus narrative in his mind, you know.
That's really cool. Okay. And then you have 1 Corinthians 8. You mentioned it earlier. Let me know if you wanted to add anything there, specifically 4 to 6.
Yeah, I mean, this is a famous passage. This is one of the most debated Christological texts in Paul. This is one of his famous, like, so-called high Christology texts, you know, where Christ is associated with the one God of Israel, where, and it's an allusion to the Shema, you know, the famous Shema of Israel that, you know, would be said 3 times a day if you like Orthodox, super strict and all that. But this is the idea of the confession of Israel. You have one God. You don't have any of the other gods. You're covenanted to the God of Israel, Yahweh. And so there's a reference to this here. And what some scholars will say is they just put Jesus up into the Shema, like it's this radical evolution for a lot of scholars. But I don't think it's that radical, honestly. There's a God and a Lord here, and these terms are used for gods and all over Greek literature, you know. So the idea of a second power in Judaism is pretty all over the place. I mean, there's lots of examples of this in Jewish apocalyptic at the time, dating all the way back to Daniel and the 2 Yahweh tradition in the Bible and the 2 powers tradition. There's a lot of this. But here, there's a clear allusion to Deuteronomy 6 and 4 already. And so that's important because it establishes the fact that he has this in mind, especially in the context of critiquing the Corinthians who've been baptized in sort of this new Exodus narrative for him. This is the beginning of the argument for why they shouldn't go out and worship idols. So this is the anti-idolatry passage. This begins his long argument against idolatry. There's a lot of scholars who've done work on this. There's a great scholar by the name of Lexi who's at Cambridge, has written a dissertation on Paul and idols. I would refer to him on idolatry stuff right now.
Cool. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. So on that kind of topic, you mentioned that there's this discussion of like, hey, is Paul saying that there was one God or is there multiple gods? And this passage he specifically says, for although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth. So this word so-called gods, what does he mean by that? Like, I mean, I've heard a lot of people say, hey, that means that he didn't actually think they were gods. They weren't gods because there is only one God. Right. Yeah. So, all right. So, all right, I'll keep reading. In heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God. So is he only saying that, hey, there are other gods, but we only worship one? Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what the text is saying. I mean, this again, you really have to know Deuteronomy pretty well, because this would be ubiquitous for Jews. I mean, for Jews who like actually live in the synagogue and like, you know, that they know anything about sort of basic identity in scriptures and all that. This is just a common, we're the people of the one God, the Shema. Yeah, of course, you know. So it's never in Deuteronomy a negation of other gods' existence, like we talked about earlier. The gods of the nations are all over Deuteronomy. The point is, you don't go after them. They're not the gods. You did not know those gods. You were covenanted to me, you know, the Most High says. I'm the one that saved you. I'm the one that purchased you. Do not go after those other gods you have not known. And so, again, this is controversial for some who just know their faith to be strictly monotheistic, you know. But I just recently co-convened a conference at Brown University with two of my dearest mates, Dan McClellan and Josiah Bisbee, along with Saul Olyan, distinguished professor of Hebrew Bible at Brown. We hosted a conference called The Meanings and End of Monotheism. And it's the meanings and ends of monotheism. Monotheism has the S in parentheses. And this conference is basically saying it was a conference for historians, like critical historians of like ancient Israelite religion all the way up into early and late antique rabbinic period in early Christianity. And we're arguing in that conference in all different time periods. We are arguing that the category of monotheism in the study of antiquity and even into late antiquity should not be used anymore for historical critical work. You know, we understand that contemporary religious movements like Judaism and Christianity and all this, the Abrahamic faiths, quote unquote, Islam, are monotheistic. You know, that's the moniker that sort of runs the show. For a lot of people that get into the study of this literature are part of those religions. So obviously they're like, well, these are our texts, you know, we're monotheism, so they're monotheism, right? You know, but if for historians of these texts, regardless of their commitments, religious commitments or ideologies or spiritual views or whatever, regardless of that, if you're just a historian of this literature, that's what this conference is about, that we held and said, there's really nothing that we could call monotheism in any sort of meaningful way in antiquity, and Jews and Christians included. So this is a very controversial topic, but I love it. I'm very invested in it, obviously. So you can look for a book next year coming out from that conference. So
nice, sweet. All right. So the last thing I had in my notes was just talking about 1 Corinthians 15 in general. You've gone a lot through over it. was there anything else that you wanted to add that really ties everything together, or anything else that you plan on mentioning in that regard?
Yeah, I would just refer back to Psalm 82 as kind of a linchpin
Hmm.
for what I'm arguing in my dissertation, the resurrection and the death of the gods. I'm calling it that this is sort of a linchpin narrative for Paul. He's imagining that the God figure that actually judges the gods, like Melchizedek in 11q Melchizedek from Qumran in the
Hmm.
Dead Sea Scrolls, this time it's actually Jesus. For Paul, this is Jesus. He is the divine figure who's ascendant, and upon his ascension, he's playing the role of the eschatological judge. He is explicitly the Melchizedekian figure of Psalm 110 for him.
Hmm.
He is the Lord that is says to the Lord says to my Lord. So the Father says to Jesus, the Son, sit in my right hand. I'll make the enemies a footstool for your feet. So Jesus is the sort of divine warrior motif, the
Hmm.
Melchizedekian motif that all the enemies of God are subject to him. Because remember, for Paul, these principalities and powers, these celestial gods, are not good. They're actually enemies for Paul, and they
Hmm.
need to be dealt with. And that's what will eventually set the cosmos right. Is once they die like men, according to Psalm
Hmm.
82, right? That's when you have this arising and judging the whole earth. Same language we have in 1 Corinthians 6. And it ties together with 1 Corinthians 15 and inherits all the nations. And Paul says, look, when you've become like the celestial bodies and these principalities and powers are destroyed, it results in the inheritance of the kingdom of God. And he says, flesh and blood can't do that. You need to be a celestial body. You need to have a pneumatic body. You need to be
Hmm.
made like the gods.
Hmm.
So,
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
And just for clarity there, so there's all this question of death at the end. It even says, "Death has been swallowed up in victory. Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" So, in Paul's eyes, do you think that, like, he's referring to like the literal death, and that, like, I guess he has some type of celestial worldview after dying, and you have an afterlife, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Death is put away with, In the ancient Hebrew Bible, it's like Mot is been slayed. It's like in the ancient Near East, Mot's like that's the word for death, is like an evil, chaos monster that needs to be
Hmm.
slain in all these ancient Near Eastern
Hmm.
myths. It's a trope, They talk about the end of death as like
Hmm.
it's like in creation when God slayed the beast, and made the world and all that. So you have a new creation,
Hmm.
where these enemies need to be slain. And Paul says the last enemy to be defeated is death,
Hmm.
which presumes the other enemies need to go first, right? They need to be dealt with. And then
Hmm.
finally, at the very end, death is done away with.
Hmm.
And that's why he brings in the quotations from the prophets. Death,
Hmm.
where's your sting? So it's
Yeah.
like victory has been accomplished at that point.
But that doesn't really mean death, though, because Paul still died. He expected to die, right? Or maybe that's a different question there.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
a different question entirely.
but like, he would it be reasonable to say that he, or maybe not, I don't know. But like, so when I'm thinking death has been swallowed up, like, I'm not gonna die anymore. And maybe Paul didn't actually think that. Maybe he thought everybody at that time
Oh, I see what
was,
you're saying.
yeah. But
Yeah,
it seems like if I'm gonna maybe think like, unless if we're talking about some like type of, end times type thing that in Paul's
yeah,
eyes, um, it seems like you have two options. Either death is swallowed up as in like that this we just don't die, not like rapture or whatever, but something happens before we have to die. Or the other option is you die, but then you keep going after that. So it's not really death because not everything is stopping. Does that make sense?
yeah. Well, let me clarify. So what
Sure.
I'm suggesting Paul means there is
Mm-hmm.
he's talking about the eschatological event. He's
Mm-hmm.
talking about the very end, not like his. So I believe, as many scholars do, as a historian, I
Mm-hmm.
believe that Paul believed he was in the eschaton, that the eschaton was at hand.
Hmm.
He believed that the end of days was at hand. He
Mhm.
says the end of the ages has fallen on you, to the
Mhm.
Corinthians. This is the last days,
Mhm.
according to Paul. So it's taking a little while there. It's like we thought it was the end of days. It's taking a little bit. But in his day, he thought it was happening. So
Uh-huh.
Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection. Because remember, resurrection in early Judaism, this is an eschatological event.
Mhm.
This is an end of days kind of a thing.
Mhm.
So this is what he thinks is happening. So the death, O death, where is your sting? That's in the final resurrection, when it's all said and done. Those who are still alive at Christ's coming,
Mhm.
will be changed, and those that will be resurrected, they'll be changed, and that's the end. And there's the great judgment of the hosts of heaven, and then the seed of Abraham takes up their rightful place as the inheritors of the cosmos with their Messiah,
Hmm.
And so this is the end, when death is finally defeated.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
that's what he has in mind.
Mhm. So was it either of those two options that I gave you there, or would you say it's
Well,
more the first one?
I don't think Paul thought he was going to die. I thought he's like, this is the resurrection. It's about to go down.
I see. Okay.
As time goes on, you're kind of like, where's the Messiah? It's like,
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting conversation there. Interesting. Okay. So we got a super chat here. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sushi. Do appreciate the super chat. Dr. Burnett, have you noticed any contemporary trends, projects in New Testament and contemporary rabbinic scholarship similar to the new perspective that cross-pollinates from Old Testament, ancient Near East, Israeli, Second Temple context?
Yeah. So not doctor yet. Still trying to get that PhD. I should have had it like 3 or 4 years ago, I'm sure, but life happens.
Almost there.
Still working on it. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of scholarship that's post New Perspective. In Paul studies, we've sort of moved past that stage. We're sort of in kind of a post New Perspective era where there's a lot of different views. I know that it's still big in Christian theological circles with these justification debates that still go on all the time. But Paul scholars are kind of like done with that. We like want to move on. So there's lots of really cool, interesting stuff being done, and if that cross-pollinate from Old Testament narratives that go into Second Temple. There's tons. I wouldn't even know where to begin. I would say some Paul scholars that you should read if you're interested in sort of historicizing Paul, like really rigid historical, critical readings of Paul in his own context. I would read people like Paula Friedrichsen, Matt Novenson, Matthew Thiessen, Stan Stowers, folks like that. Those are the types of people that have made big impacts on me.
Okay, really cool stuff. Awesome. All right, and he also, or she, I don't know actually the gender, but let's see. Yeah. So, do you recommend any New Testament scholars or ones that are versed in Old Testament scholarship, Divine Council Worldview, that are worth mentioning here? Resources they can check out.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Again, the Divine Council Worldview thing. I know that my late dear friend Mike Heiser really championed this.
Sure.
And it's still being championed by the Michael Heiser Foundation. And I love a lot of those people. But as a historian, I would say that I would read more ancient Mediterranean primary literature that deals with the gods and origin stories of the gods and all that. And there's I know some really good technical works. I'm trying to think if there's any really good intro stuff. And I'm having a hard time coming up with some right now on the fly. Yeah, I would have to if you email me, I'm sure he'll put some link to my academia or something in there.
Yeah.
Just email me or message me and I'll try to come up with something for you.
All right, cool, awesome. And we could maybe put that in the description later. But all right, Thank you so much for coming on. It's really a pleasure. We'll have to do this again. Thank you so much. Any last thoughts? Anything else you want to say? Of course, everybody check out academia.edu and on the link in the description for all your work. You're going to have a book coming out, right? Soon, sometime?
Well, yeah, we'll have a book coming out. Like it's going to be, these academic books take a long time, so it's probably going to be over a year before you see it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Well, in a year, when people are watching this in 2 years, they'll be like, "Oh, wow, yeah, it's active, right?"
That's right.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks so much, David. Hope you have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for having me.
Awesome.